an interesting and substantive meeting. We have several things to catch up on. Most importantly, and I think most of our time will be spent on the community college funding formula and the discussions and the work that's going on to move that forward, which we appreciate. So let's see. First, though, we need to get the administrative work out of the way. You have in front of you the November 9th minutes from the subcommittee. Can I have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved, Madam Chair.
Thank you. A second?
Second, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Any discussion or corrections? Okay, all in favor, aye?
Aye.
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 Okay. Thank you. Minutes are approved. Let's see, Guthrie, would you go ahead and call the roll, please?
Of course, Madam Chair. Sandy Rowe,
Present?
Harry Cross,
Present.
Greg Heyman,
Here.
Emily Simnett,
Present.
Richard Devlin,
Present.
Kaya Adams,
Present.
Vanessa Becker, Arnell Fajardo. And I know for the record that Commissioner Fernando Rojas Galvan is also here.
Oh, good. Just a note for those of you who are just joining, I'm on a new computer and it's showing only 4 squares, and 2 of them are people who aren't on camera, and I'm not sure how to change it. So please, during the meeting, commissioners, speak up. I may not see you. You can use the hand raised little symbol, but I may not see that either, so don't hesitate to jump in. We want to have a full and rich discussion. We have 3 items, really. We have the public comment from Ms. Hudgens, who is there in Salem. And then we have the briefing on the community college funding formula. But before we do that, I think we'll go first to the public comment. Then after that, I've asked Ben to do, the executive director, to do a summary for us, really, of the context of the formula funding and a little bit of the history, including what we did with the university funding, just so that we all and the new members of the commission have the full context of where the community college funding formula fits in with both our philosophy and with what we've done in the past. But we'll go ahead now and start with the public testimony.
Hello, everyone. This is certainly a new experience. My name is Tracy Hodson. I teach history at Chemacabee Community College, and I'm here today as the president of the Oregon Education Association Community College Council. The council submitted written testimony to you, expressing concern about the possibility of performance-based funding being in a community college funding proposal coming before the HECC in the next 2 months. The most important part about that testimony is that academics who have studied performance-based funding across the nation for the last 20 years have concluded that it does not improve student academic success. And in fact, there is a number of unintended consequences that can be very negative impacts to our most vulnerable students. So we need to proceed with caution before we adopt the failed policies of other states. It's possible in the next 2 months that you will see a proposal from the HECC CCSF Formula Review Work Group, of which I am a part, and I believe you're about to get a report. I want you to know that as a member of that committee, if you get such a report, you can know that it was a rubber stamp of something that another group did or that HECC staff did, because there has been no place for substantive discussion or a decision-making process or a discernment process in that work group. 90% of the work group meetings are composed of HECC staff talking to us. Then there's a little bit of space for us to ask a few questions, But there's never been the opportunity to actually have a meaningful discussion in which all voices are heard. In fact, of the 40 members of the work group, there are many that have never even spoken once and have even had a space to speak in the last 9 months. I must conclude that HECC staff does not believe that higher ed professionals have the expertise or the wisdom to be a part of shaping the funding process. And I base that on how they've shaped the meetings over the last 9 months. That mostly there's not even a place for us to speak. There was a consultant, HCM strategist, that was brought in mid-year this year. I couldn't see any difference in the way that the meetings were run. If they were hired to help create a meaningful decision-making process, then they failed to do so. I must say, from the few times that members were actually allowed to speak in meetings, I don't see that there's any great support for performance-based funding in the members. I do see universal concern about the consequence of changing anything in the funding formula. And there is universal frustration in the fact that the meetings have not allowed us to have any kind of discussion or decision-making process. I remember at one meeting, a college administrator said, I have a lot of expertise in this and I really want to share, I really want to help. But there really wasn't a place for that. So if you get a recommendation from that work group, know that it doesn't really reflect the expertise and the wisdom of those on the work group, because we haven't been able to participate or share or really even talk. HECC staff has never really created a place for us to. That's my testimony. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for the testimony. Questions? Again, we're going to stay on the larger subject for a while, so there will be time for more questions and comments as we go forward on this. Thank you for the testimony and for your concerns. I hope as we go through this some more, you'll see that there is real concern and attention to the concerns. I think we are perhaps starting from a different philosophical base in terms of what the role of the formula and how it can help performance and how it can also emphasize the values that we have and want to promote. So let's go forward on the discussion and see what questions there are as we go forward. Okay, Ben, are you ready? Director
Yeah, I
Cannon?
would note that Commissioner Rojas Galvan has his hand raised.
Oh, thank you.
Madam Chair.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Rojas Galvin.
Thank you. Yes, this question is, I think I have a lot of questions in process, but I will, one that comes to mind is for Tracy. What would, in your vision, Tracy, would be a space for faculty to, as an example, to share thoughts, ideas, opinions? I mean, what would that look like in your opinion, to have those voices heard?
I think the work group is a great idea. But this is a big, to do a recommendation like a community college funding formula, that takes a very robust process in which people can speak and talk and share and look at different ideas. Faculty are represented on the work group. I think that the formula of the work group formulation is fine. It just hasn't been a vehicle by which some meaningful discussion has really happened. Like I said, there's only very short periods in the meeting where people that are on the work group are even allowed to speak. So I think we have the mechanism in place. I mean, certainly you can have forums and ask people to come in, but I think that faculty voices are pretty well represented on the work group.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Director Cannon.
Yeah, thanks. So as Chair Rowe mentioned, she asked me to provide a little bit of the background, particularly for newer commissioners, although I found it useful even to remind myself about how we got to here. and consideration of a new funding formula for or a revised funding formula for community colleges, and some of the principles and philosophy that undergirds the commission's history of exercising its authority with respect to funding formulas. And so I'll spend a few minutes on that history and background, and then welcome questions, comments. This is we're living this history too. I don't mean to imply that this is all sort of set in stone, and that the prior perspective of the commission and commissioners can't be altered. We have changed and grown and learned as a commission. I think that's been reflected in some of the ways in which our sort of policy priorities and philosophies have evolved and adapted over the years. And I look forward to continuing that process and that project with all of you. But I do want to take us back, if you'll indulge me, to the beginning of the HECC in 2013, and upon the governance changes to Oregon higher education that established the HECC and made other shifts to how higher education is organized and governed in Oregon. Shortly after being created, this new commission, the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, identified in its strategic documents at that time a new paradigm in which the state would fund independently governed public institutions, community colleges, and public universities in ways that maximized learning outcomes and student success. Those were the exact words that the commission used then. And it contrasted that funding approach with an old paradigm it described as one in which the state passively allocated resources to institutions based on enrollment. So it attempted to contrast a more active funding, that approach that maximizes learning outcomes and student success, with a more passive funding and historic funding approach that was based exclusively on enrollment. And that shift, in the commission's view, reflected the state's increasing focus on the importance of student completion, especially in an era of rapidly rising student debt. Right, the consequences of non-completion are greater today for the student than they were when college was much more affordable, when the student was much less likely to incur debt along the way. That shift also, in perspective that the commission described there, reflected its early perspective, initial perspective, I think, on institutional accountability. And specifically, commissioners at the time believed that public institutions should be free to operate with minimal direct state oversight. They sort of felt like that was the job of independently elected boards of directors of community colleges and state-appointed, governor-appointed trustees of public universities and the administrators that they oversee and hire. So minimal state oversight, but with a state funding system that rewarded and incentivized institutions for improving student success and equity outcomes. Consistent with that perspective, and as that perspective sort of grew and took hold at the commission, in 2014-15, the commission overhauled the formula by which we allocate, the HECC allocates state funds to public universities. And again, historically, those funds have been allocated entirely or almost entirely on the basis of student FTE enrollment. So the HECC inherited a funding distribution formula for public universities that was almost entirely, 98, 99% based on student FTE enrollment. The new HECC formula, which was developed over a couple of years through, in partnership with a lot of institutional representatives and other partners, was phased in over 3 years and allocates today about half of the total of the state appropriation for public universities on the basis of degree completion outcomes, with heavy weights for underrepresented students. The implementation of that new formula over the last now 7 years has corresponded with rising completion rates across the public universities. And you've seen that even in the data that Director Amy Cox presented last month to the commission. Now, while it's difficult to establish a causal link, and we're not asserting that there is one here between the change to the state funding formula and the rising completion rates and some narrowing of equity gaps at public universities, it is clear from our work with it has been clear from our work with institutional leadership, including members of boards of trustees and presidents and other administrators and university leaders, that the HEC's emphasis, the state's emphasis on completion and funding completion, especially for underrepresented students, where there's a significant premium for their successful completion of degrees and certificates, has helped reinforce the institutional efforts to increase student success. So it creates a sort of virtuous cycle of institutions that themselves, by mission and by design and by philosophy, are committed to student success and are now receiving reinforcement for that project through funding from the state. In 2017, sort of advancing in the Commission's strategic documents and strategic planning, the Commission adopted a strategic framework. This is the one that's still operable today and that you are acquainted with. A strategic framework that built on its prior commitment to being an active funder of post-secondary education. Again, sort of contrasting that with the more passive enrollment-driven funding of the past. The framework identifies the 4 primary mechanisms or levers through which the HECC will influence outcomes. And the second category, those are reporting, funding, pathways, streamlined pathways, and learner outreach. And that second category, funding for success, if you read the section, commits the HECC to developing approaches to state funding that are directly linked to student success. The framework also describes that this is not just a question of funding allocation or funding distribution, but also funding sufficiency, right? That being a funder of student success means also advocating for the resources that are required for our students and for our institutions to succeed, but that they are also intentionally invested or directed by the state. So coming towards the community college process, in 2021, after a number of meetings of this subcommittee, hearing testimony and having some discussion, this F&A subcommittee of the HECC charged HECC staff with establishing a work group to consider changing the formula by which state funding is distributed to community colleges. This is one of our core authorities and responsibilities as a commission. The subcommittee established some principles or created some direction for that work group. It indicated that a new formula should support the education goals established in the Commission's strategic plan, should focus on student access and success with an emphasis on underrepresented populations, should encourage flexible pathways to high demand and high reward career fields, should incentivize co-requisite developmental education options, should use clearly defined currently available data, and should maintain clarity, simplicity, and stability. The HECC then and now, this subcommittee then and now, have recognized that community colleges are different than public universities. And I described the work that we've done on public university funding, on the public university formula, because it is part of the sort of context and backdrop and history of this subcommittee and commission. And it does reflect the larger perspective that the commission has taken to how we fund our institutions. But we recognize the difference. This commission has recognized the differences between community colleges and public universities and acknowledged that they call for different funding approaches. The commission's recognized, for example, that while nearly all university students enroll seeking a degree, community college students are much more varied in their aims. Likewise, student success is, or therefore student success is not as simple to capture, right? It can't be summarized or boiled down or measured as succinctly as we feel university student success can typically be measured. And therefore, the completion of degrees, certificates, or programs should probably not drive as much formula funding as it does, for example, for our universities. I mentioned the roughly half of our university funding formula that's keyed to those student completion measures. I'd be surprised if the commission were to endorse a proposal that went so far, given the more varied and sometimes hard to discern nature of student success at community colleges. Likewise, this commission has recognized and I think very much supports the open access mission and spirit of community colleges, and would also likely not support a funding approach that was at odds with community colleges' commitment to serving our communities, many of our communities' most vulnerable, highest barrier populations facing the highest barriers to success. And it would be very much not in keeping with this commission's philosophy and action if a funding formula were to diminish or be at odds with the community college's mission and design to serve those populations. But we have recognized that the access mission of community colleges should be fused with greater levels of resources and intention around student success. So the work group that was sort of charged and sponsored by this subcommittee has been meeting since last spring in an effort to ultimately advise HECC staff on recommendations to the commission for a modified distribution formula of state resources to community colleges. We've been heartened, I mean, speaking for, I guess, myself and the staff at the HECC, have been heartened by the willingness of the work group members to consider and take on big issues, such as the potential inclusion of outcomes, demographics, and program types and characteristics as metrics that could help drive funding. Today, the community college formula is almost exclusively an student FTE driven formula, and this work group has, engaged with the difficult questions of potentially recommending the inclusion of other metrics or weighting in order to better reflect the commitments of the commission, the state, and our institutions. We've appreciated the regular reports that we've received at this committee, both from HECC staff and work group participants. You'll be hearing from President Tim Cook from Clackamas Community College later on this afternoon. And our intent is to draw this process to a conclusion in the first half of 2023 with recommendations from HECC staff based on or advised by the work group coming to you in February, and a rulemaking process to conclude by June. So that's kind of a little bit of how we got to here, a reminder for most of you of some of the recent history of this work group and how it will intersect with the commission's actions and considerations and actions in the months to come. And Chair Rowe, I'm happy to take any questions, or we can move into a little more detailed report about some of the recent findings of the work group.
Are there questions for Ben before we move on? You can also ask questions of Ben once we get the report of sort of where we are with the work group, and then also hear from Tim Cook, who, as president of Clackamas Community College, is also a member of the work group. So we've got two more segments here during which we can have discussion. But any questions now for Ben? Okay, Jim, it looks like we're ready to move on. If you will please start us off and let us know where the work group is and where the staff is on this. Thank you very much, Ben. That was excellent.
Yes, certainly, Madam Chair. Thank you very much. Commissioners, for the record, Jim Pinkert, Post-Secretary of Finance and Capital, good to be here with you. I wanted to talk just very briefly about kind of a quick update where we're at with the work group, then wanted to tag team my partner, Donna Willing, into the conversation, and then also get Tim Cook, President Cook's perspective. The work group has recently identified some advantages of the current funding formula, but also discussed that the formula could likely be better aligned with existing state higher education goals. Common ground has been identified, we believe, around adding consideration for adult learners, addressing the cost of CTE coursework, and promoting equitable student success. And so with those three areas of common ground in mind, recently we conducted a survey of the worker membership to determine the level of support for various concepts as we start looking toward a formula framework at our next meeting, I hope on December 15th. The key takeaways of that survey are noted in your docket item and spelled out in detail, but I just want to note that there's a lot of support for including priority populations of underrepresented students. There's clear support for including non-credit courses and credentials. However, not much support exists for allocating funding based on progression or completion metrics and allocating anything over 10% of the total funding for targeted funding for student-centered funding was not popular, with a preference toward recommending a specific dollar amount as opposed to a relative percentage. And so I quickly just pointed out some of the highlights in that survey. There's much more information in the document item. The appendix of the document item includes weighted averages of the responses for all 13 survey questions, again, conducted by HCM strategists. And we had a pretty good, robust turnout. I believe about 80% of the entire worker membership participated in the survey. And so that was, we think, very valuable feedback to receive. We're going to, at the December 15th, next work group meeting next week, we're going to review that feedback and then talk further and hopefully develop a formula framework. So I'll pause there for questions and then to defer to Donald.
Yes, Commissioner Devlin.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple of comments and maybe a question. I was actually concerned by the comments under public testimony in terms of what people thought was the lack of ability to participate. At the same time, this issue about performance-based allocation of funds, I think there is a difference in how you would look at this. If it was something that was going to be based on individual faculty members and individual students, that would be a typical performance-based area where I think there would be very little legitimate concerns. However, the state having some ability or expectation of greater performance of the institutions that it funds, I think is just basically the nature of government. If you put more funding into something, you expect that there'll be more outcomes that are positive. And I know that we are facing this issue of, we've already recommended to the governor and ultimately to the legislature that they fund community colleges at a significantly higher level, even after we recognize what's going to be an underlying issue, that their enrollment has precipitously dropped before COVID and then precipitously dropped more. And we're basically funding somewhere in the neighborhood of 60% of the students we were funding 5 or 6 years ago, and now being asked to spend a lot more public dollars in that funding. So I think the state having some expectation of improvement in performance is not something that you wouldn't expect. It would be normal. I mean, the legislature is going to expect that there's going to be some improvement in performance if they're asked to fund community college at a significantly higher level with significantly fewer students actually going through the system. The other thing is I was kind of not, the response to the questionnaire seemed to go to the, well, I'd say the lowest expectation. So we would want to base this simply on enrollment, simply on number of hours enrolled, and not completions, or ultimately not actually completions of individual certificates or associate degrees. And that harkens to me to discussions in the legislature. I'd hate to make this analogy, but when we were trying to look at all the various programs being offered, like in addictions, various nonprofit institutions only wanted to be judged by the number of people they brought through treatment, not the number that actually didn't using it in the future or didn't have a drug-related problem in the future. It's one thing to simply want to count widgets versus counting the quality of the products that you're actually producing. And I think the expectation is growing in the public sector that there should be some expectation as more dollars are invested, that there's some improvement in performance. That's, I think, something that's not going to go away. But I do understand particularly the comments where you try to tie individual student performance to individual faculty members as not being a very positive or workable once you look at the details of what that would actually imply. So I'm looking forward to the rest of this discussion, but I do wish there was some greater opportunity for broader discussion at the work group, if that's a broadly held feeling by the participants.
Thank you, Commissioner Devlin. That's very helpful. Commissioner Hayman, you had your hand up, I believe.
No, thank you so much, Chair Rowe. I really appreciated Director Cannon's summary of sort of the process by which we got here. And while I wasn't a commissioner at the beginning, I was certainly paying attention to it at the beginning, and I've watched that. And I guess, Jim, I'm wondering, as we summarize sort of what I certainly have understood to be the objectives of this committee, which is, I think, as again, Director Cannon has described, it seems to me that some of the conversation might still be based on a disagreement in what the goal is of the committee. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, the extent you not just sort of we're focusing on, not what do we do, but do we actually, to what extent is there agreement around the objective of thinking about funding as targeting to success, I think is specifically stated in our objective as a commission. I think also a shift in orientation, which is, I think reflects Commissioner Devlin's comment, sort of a thinking perhaps differently about funding the effort put into an exercise as over and against, or in addition to funding related to the effect that effort has on students or on success or on marketability or whatever it is that we're looking for. Those seem to be principles that were described in sort of how we entered into this process. And I guess some of what I hear in the feedback is we don't agree on those principles. And I guess if you could comment on that, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, I see Donna has joined us. I didn't know, Donna, did you want to address that and jump in, or should I?
Go ahead, I'll chime in after you if there's something I want to add, so.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think we have established through the work group process and the meetings that we've held every month since March, although we skipped September. But in these monthly conversations, we did start back in the spring with a conversation around what does success mean? And if we were to identify and define success, what could that look like? And although I don't know that we landed on a specific definition with the work group membership, I think there was broad expression at that time and sense that, success is different in the 2-year sector than it is the 4-year sector, because students attend for very different reasons. They could be coming to take 1 or 2 classes only, and not even trying to transfer or seek a credential or pass CTE or anything else. So, and the non-credential, non-credit coursework is a growing component of the mission of many of our community colleges. And so because of that diversity of goal seeking by our students, it's tough to narrow down and define one conclusive definition of success. But if we were to want to pursue success through a funding formula, what could that look like? And so that conversation through the work group process led to ultimately where we're at right now, which is kind of this growing consensus around we like the current formula and what it's trying to accomplish, but understand that it could be better. There's room for improvement. And so that improvement could look like, yes, we do and could perhaps focus a little more on equitable student success. Because really, at the end of the day, if we want to see our most vulnerable students, our underrepresented students succeed, we are going to have to collaborate with the institutions to ensure they have the resources they need to assist those students toward their path to success and achieving success, the student's definition of success. So how do we do that? How do we do that? We've spent some time talking about that.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Yes, you can.
So this really ties back to Commissioner Devlin's comment. I understand the diversity of student interests and needs related to community college. I'm wondering if you think, or if the committee thinks, that given the level of state support, if there's some, is the definition of success solely determined by the student, or does the state have an interest in defining success in some sense? Does the state have a role in defining what success is?
I mean, I can give you my own personal response to that. I don't know that we've addressed that question in specific detail with the work group membership itself. I can tell you we've had conversations where some of those issues have come up, especially around when we talk CTE, for example. Are we interested in just funding CTE and addressing the cost of it? Or are we interested in funding high value CTE, which is one of the questions that we asked through the survey. And then the question really, as we're talking to some of the members of the work group, the formula review work group, the question is, well, what do you mean by high value? Do you mean high value to the student? Do you mean high value to the state? Do you mean high value to employers? Do you mean high value to the community that the community college serves? And so a valid question, a good question, might though beget a response that feels very much like a D, all of the above response. And so I think our hope is to continue those conversations with the work group membership to try to get a better handle on what can the work group support as it looks toward making its own set of recommendations.
I think it's such
Yes, please go
Chair,
ahead,
I think it's such an important question. And I think it's ultimately one for the commission to answer, right? I think this is really fundamental to sort of how you see your role and the state's role relative to higher education. Historically, this commission, the HECC, and I think it's harder to speak for the legislature, but many members of the legislature have explicitly or implicitly said that there are certain state goals with respect to higher education, right? That success of higher education can't be measured or shouldn't be measured strictly in terms of, or exclusively in terms of, the student's view of success, but that the state benefits from certain forms of success, that something like the 40-40-20 goal and other goals that we've established and that the legislature has established for student completion, those are about the well-being of students, of course, but they're also about the well-being of our larger communities, right? Of our employers, of our economy, of our community kind of fabric. And that I think the state, at least the HECC, has put the thumb on its thumb on a scale with respect to there being state values and priorities for student success, and that it shouldn't all be defined at the individual level, right? And I think it's complicated, right? Because for any individual, of course, right, they ought to have the autonomy and the integrity to define success for themselves, right? And far be it from any of us to stand between how a student defines success and and themselves, right? But the state has, we have goals and values and measurements of the the success of our system that reflects certain kinds of state priorities. So that's been where I think the commission has been historically, but it's such a profoundly important question. Thanks, Greg.
Yes, Commissioner Cross, and then I want to come back for comment.
Okay, I just want to reinforce something that I think I just heard Ben say, and it was similar in our conversations a couple of years ago, that as the HECC, we have an obligation to advance the policies that are best statewide. It's also our job to help every institution do the very best job that it can do, and to advance higher education, supporting those institutions with the dollars that they need.
The same one.
We got
Excuse me,
somebody on.
someone, I think one of our guests is not on mute.
You
just check, thank you.
Thanks. I want to say that I think that we have very few mechanisms at our disposal to influence public policy nationwide or statewide, and one of those is the funding formula. And so it would behoove us to really examine that carefully as probably one of our most important mechanisms to establish the importance of the outcomes that we want to see in alignment with the policies that we encourage. And in many ways, this is a small nudge. It's a small amount of the funding formula that we're addressing here. So I just want to clearly state that I do think it's our role in this development of this funding formula to have incorporated into that some amount of outcomes. I do think that one of the things I would ask the work group to think carefully about is the issue of equity and the nature of the possible way that might be, has to be approached, because it doesn't look the same at every institution across the state. And there are likely some outcomes that lend themselves more to what someone described earlier is, I think Ben said, the population with the highest barriers to success. We want to be able to support community colleges break down those barriers to success. And I think that's possible to do in showing what those outcomes look like. And I think it's possible to be creative so that in different areas of the state, we are supporting the populations that will show us from our statewide policy point of view that we are having successes across the state. I finally, my last comment, I want to address the issue of the past research about this. We've been at this for over 6 months, now maybe almost 8 months, and we've had presented to us a number of different types of research. From what I can see, the older studies have been the most critical, and the newer literature is much more positive. That probably, I hope that means that as we go along, we've learned more about how to do this well, and seeing now places where we've had success. I think finally, for me, the most persuasive argument for why we would include outcomes in the formula is the success that we've already had at the university level. It certainly has been rewarding to see our policy priorities reflected in the real data that apparently strongly influenced by that funding formula. I think it's harder actually for us to get it right with the community colleges, and so the work group really has a really steep set of challenges before it. I just want to make sure that they have a clear understanding of how I'm leading as a leader at the commission, but also understanding the challenges that the task group we've charged them with, basically. So I think that's it for me.
Thank you everyone for these very substantive and interesting and helpful comments. Just as a quick wrap up of just this segment to emphasize a piece I think that Chair Cross and Director Cannon were getting at in terms of the principles that we are using or that guide us. We know and have articulated many ways that the state cares deeply about completion, whether it's certificate, whether it's degree. That certainly is not the individual necessarily measure of success or the only one, but to ignore that, especially to ignore that when we have said as a commission that in underrepresented groups, that is how we will judge ourselves and our work and the state on how we were doing. And so if we have that as a measure of success and we're committed to the principle of completion as a factor, and especially among those who have been who are underrepresented, then it seems to me we have to look at changes in the formula and how to measure that. It won't be a perfect measurement. It won't be the absolute measurement, but I think it's necessary, especially again, for those who have had, as Ben said, the greatest barriers. So if we can go ahead now and Donna Llewellyn, are you up next or are we back to you, Jim?
I think Jim will go first and then I'll talk a little bit and then turn it over to President Cook.
Okay, thank you.
I was actually done. I didn't have anything else to add. So Donna, I'll defer to you.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, so I just want to talk to you a little bit about some of the groups that are actually meeting to have important conversations related to the CCSF distribution formula. So we've talked about the CCSF work group itself. So that's been the place where we've shared information. We've had some pretty difficult conversations. And along the way, we've gathered quite a few comments during those conversations. Our next steps actually include bringing back pieces where we believe we may actually have policy points for the work group to actually consider for implementing into a framework. There's also this other group, I kind of refer to it as the OPC kind of technical subcommittee. And that group was convened in late spring, early summer at the request of the President's Council to talk about the technical aspects of the funding formula, including how certain policy recommendations or things that might be considered might affect and be implemented in the existing funding formula. And these are business officers and presidents who have a pretty good understanding and knowledge of how the actual funding formula itself actually works, because it's a pretty complicated mechanism when it comes down to it. And then, of course, there's the HECC staff and HCM Strategies, our hired consultant, and we've been meeting with both groups and we're working to coordinate efforts, recognizing that both of those groups have strong expertise within them. And we meet frequently with both. We meet frequently with HCM Strategies, both before and after each work group meeting, and then as other topics come up that need to be addressed. So we're staying in constant communication with that group and trying to make sure we're pulling all of these pieces together, because it is a multi-layered conversation. And Really, that's all I wanted to just share with you, that there are a lot of people having quite a bit of conversations about very specific areas. And there are representatives from the work group that are on this technical subcommittee. So I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. It's not like this group that's just meeting off to the side. There's back and forth. And I say that, and actually I'm just going to turn it right over to President Cook to share additional comments, and to, if he wanted to add anything about how I characterize the different groups, I would be more than happy to let refer to him. So.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair, Commissioners. Thank you. Can you hear me? I'm muted. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Thanks. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. One of the benefits of going last is I get to hear all the comments and all the questions, and so I have some responses to some of those that I'll add here in a second. I will say, just as a caveat as I jump in, the presidents are meeting tomorrow and discussing this issue. So there's a small group of us that have been involved in the work group, but the larger group hasn't talked about the survey results yet and really processed this through yet. So I want to give a caveat that some of the comments I'm making are based on my own assessment of this, and then leading the President's Council this year in that part of it. We'll be discussing this in detail, including your comments today and the feedback that we're hearing today. I really appreciated Commissioner Devlin and Commissioner Hayman's questions around what student success is and accountability and the performance measures. I think it's really important. And I don't think any one of us is surprised that given state money and given state funds, that there want to be some sort of accountability measure and some way to really track success around that. I don't think that's been the concern of ours at all as we look at this. And really, I think, and you said it really well, that the difference between the universities and the community colleges is where it becomes challenging on how we do this work. And I like to say when I'm talking to our business partners in Clackamas County that the success of Clackamas Community College is because we can provide quality education and employees then for the community, and make sure that we have taxpayers, and we make sure that we are doing what we need to be the economic engine of the county. So our success depends on how well we do with our partners there, and I think my colleagues across the state would do that. Where it's been interesting, or where what for a long time, and I think this example. I use welding all the time. We rarely get a welding person to graduate through with a 2-year degree. We're happy when they get a certificate welding, because they all get hired way before they ever get finished. And so it's what does that mean for success? I mean, we think it's a great success for them. Manufacturing has been the same way recently, and certainly some of our other programs. Where it's changing even further, and I think where you're hearing maybe some concern on those survey results and some others, is as we're hearing from our partners, business partners and others, the need for short-term training, for non-credit, for in some cases just literally skills-based training that's really quite short, is the accountability measures that would come in around that. So we've heard often that we don't have time for an employee to go through a year-long certificate program, or even a 6-month one. We need some skills now. We need to get them to work. So we're trying to meet those needs, and we're hearing more and more then, and we're certainly shifting to more of this new environment of non-credit and short-term certificates. So when we think about accountability for that, certainly we'd love for those students to come back and get 1-year certificates or 2-year degrees, or if they choose to transfer on. But there's some instances right now that we need to really track and see some of that as we get along there more. And then so all that work you're hearing around CTE and really making sure that we're getting the funding for those high priority programs and high cost programs is to make sure that we can really deliver on that promise to our communities. But I think the other side of it, and I heard this a number of times from several of you, really the access for underserved populations really becomes critical. We need the support and the resources to get students in, but then more importantly, to retain these students that may not have had advantages that many others have had, or may have specific challenges or need more wraparound support, being able to make sure that they're retained and that they do complete whatever success measures that that are put in place for them. So we are very interested in looking at this new formula and thinking about how do we attract and retain populations, underserved populations, systemically non-dominant populations, and others that really have been underserved in the past, but understanding the real need. And then I think there's another, and I'm going to stop here in a second because I want to make sure I can answer questions. We talked about this, I think, the last time we met with you. Because so many of our students now are part-time, upwards of 80% of them are part-time, this issue around headcount and how that fits into the formula with FTE is becoming more important to us as we think about the number of students and the being able to offer each of them those wraparound services that they need. So I've been a little bit all over the place, but I wanted to come back because I didn't, it wasn't that I took offense to it at all. I think in some ways we all want to make sure that we're utilizing the state funds appropriately and that we're good stewards of our resources. It's where we're trying to sort this out is what's the best way to do that really meets the needs of these populations, whether they're adult learners that are working on their GED or whether they're a transfer student that wants to go on to our universities. And it's a complex challenge, but it's something that, we have been working on for several months. I think we're getting closer. I said last time, I'll say it again. I think we are really trying to be collaborative and really meet the goals of the commission and the goals that you put forward in a way that serves our students across the state. So I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Questions for President Cook? Other comments?
Thank you.
President Cook, go ahead, Commissioner Adams.
Sorry about that. I can use my electronic hand raise. Sorry about that, Chair. President Cook, thank you for the comments and for helping to sensitize us to the differences between the community college mandate outcomes practices and the four-year university practices. I'm new to this, so please forgive me if I push a bruise, but there's something I'm struggling to understand as someone who's new to it. It seems that the HECC is carrying out a thoughtful and deliberative process to understand how we can get to improved outcomes that are important to the state. And it seems, listening to you and other folks providing public testimony, that you are committed to that as well. But given the energy that was in the room, can you help me understand where the mismatch in communication is happening, or what's causing the tension there? I can't quite figure it out because we haven't made a decision. We're still exploring. Is it the prospect of change that is making folks uncomfortable, or what's generating the discomfort?
Thank you for that question. And I'm not entirely sure. I'll just be quite frank. I think some of it might be just the change and what that means. I know when we've been talking about this, and I'll own my own statements here. I think some of it is until we've had a chance to really model some of the formula changes and really look at some of the potential unintended consequences. What might pulling lever A do to opportunity C over here. That there's just some concern. I mean, I guess to put it in context, navigating a community college during the pandemic there was never stability. I mean, we were constantly reacting as everybody was, right? And so we're coming out of the last 2 years of trying to keep these institutions afloat and trying to maintain some or get some stability in how we're operating. And so this this following that, even though I know this has been in place for a while, the conversation has been in place for a while, feels like another issue to react to that will potentially upset the apple cart. And again, I'm speaking for myself, but so it's not that the work itself isn't work we shouldn't be doing. It's more about how do we do it in a way that causes the least amount of harm to our institutions, to our students, and the rest. So I think some of the energy that you're hearing is about what is the potential impact. I can't speak for others, but what does it impact our missions and how we operating in the rest, and that is some of what I think I'm hearing there. So I suspect as we my personal experience with this is when I worked in the state of Washington, we went through a process like this, and it was challenging. It also took a couple of years to really shake it out and to really work through it. It was a difficult, demanding process. So I knew that going in, that this was not going to be, you get smart people together and figure out a formula and yay, we're done. I knew there was going to be, this push and pull. It's more about, again, how do we now, Donna referred to the technical group, really start getting into the details and think, what does it mean if I'm incentivized to put more resources into this group, and how will that impact another group that I may need to be supporting, or how in the bottom line, how may I lose funding, or have some challenges that I wasn't even aware of at the time, if that helps answer that question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much. And to the extent that you can, I hope you take back to the President's Council that, we certainly are listening both to the words and to the energy that is in the room. But I send back a message, which is that these outcomes are critical to the state long run. They're critical to our economy. They're critical to basic literacy. They're probably critical to demography. And so, although the conversation will be difficult, we will endeavor. I actually think these community college, for the community that I grew up in, the community college outcomes are probably more important than the four-year institution outcomes. My mom is a graduate of one of these certificate programs. So this is just so important. And if there's a way that we can behave, if there are words that we can use to indicate openness and seriousness, I'm open to feedback. But I'm excited about this path we're going to walk, because I think it's really, really important.
Thank you, Commissioner. I certainly have a bias. I think our mission is pretty critical. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Adams and President Cook. I think, and Commissioner Adams brings up a wonderful point. Everyone has really. This is hard because it's hard. It does present a lot of change, and people who are most dedicated and most involved and most committed to community colleges are the ones who rightly feel they have the highest stake, and who have been at times the most critical, and who can't yet see if there's any benefit to them of change. The change is big change, but it's a black box right now to them in terms of knowing how it will affect. So I think that's true. And I think we did early on. There are a few people, again, understandably, with the level of change and all everyone's been through, who were just, no, enough, leave something alone. And so I think that's part of the energy we felt too. And we know that too comes from a place of real caring on their part and commitment. And that's why I think it's important that we are open, as all of you have been today, about our commitment to doing this thoughtfully, and also our commitment to getting it done. I also think it's understandable and correct, but it's unfortunate in a way that the universities went first, because that lets the fear sort of have a label, oh, it's going to be like that, when I think what we're all saying is we know how both critical and distinct the missions in our communities and for our state that community colleges have. And we are committed to strengthening that. I mean, this also comes with, as as Ben said at the beginning, with our commitment to do everything, absolutely everything in our power to increase the pool of funding for community colleges and to help make them successful. So I really appreciate all of the thoughtful comments and
Madam
questions.
Chair, I noticed
Yeah.
that Commissioner Hayman has his hand raised as well.
Oh, thank you, Commissioner Hayman.
Thank you, Chair Rowe. First of all, I have appreciated President Cook's voice ever since he came to the great state of Oregon from Washington, and has added, I think, deep thought. And I think one of the things that he makes so clear is the role that presidents have in preserving the integrity of their institutions in the context of this conversation. And I just think it's so critical that we recognize that. You all know I was community college president for 17 years. I know how difficult it is to go through funding revisions. My institution was significantly involved in one we called equalization. That predates, I think, everyone except Ben. But had significant impacts on the funding of the various 17 institutions. And yet we found that the critical role of providing a similar level of funding for all students, regardless of where they were in this state, was a goal worth pursuing. It's a hard goal. And I think the goal that we're now trying to pursue, one of making a stronger relationship between goals like completion, like equitable outcomes, like focus on specific programmatic areas that are essential to the future of the economy of the state. Those are similarly important. And I don't, as a commissioner, I don't want to back away from that. But I think this conversation is so rich in helping me, and I hope all of us to understand sort of the more complex conversation. How do we do this and pursue those goals, connect our resources to those goals, not backing away from that, but at the same time recognize that this is terribly difficult and important work for our presidents, and need to respect that in the process. So again, President Cook, I really appreciate that word that you've brought to this conversation.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Commissioner Simnett.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone who has spoken. In fact, I hesitated raising my hand to make a comment because I'm very new to this. I'm new to the commission, and I'm new to the issue, and new to this subcommittee. But I felt I would be remiss if I didn't just extend my gratitude to everyone who has spoken today, and to all of the members of the work group who are, despite the challenge of the situation, dedicated to coming up with a solution that is good for Oregon and good for our students. I was especially moved by thinking of the commitment when a student decides to invest in their education and decides to enroll in a class, whether it's credit bearing or whatever program, that we have a responsibility to them to do what we can to support them in succeeding in that, and that is an investment in the student, and respecting their decision, as well as an investment in the community. So I just wanted to extend my thanks, let you know that I'm listening, and will be continuing to learn about this issue in advance when it comes back to us in February. And to also say that I appreciate that faculty also are on the front line of working with students, and have an important voice in these conversations as well. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you, commissioners and guests, and Jim and Donna and Ben and everyone. Okay. We look forward to seeing where we are with this, and more good work and difficult work ahead, but we look forward to getting another report and or recommendation in February. Thank you. Okay, now we're going to move to the public university general fund update. Jim Pickard, I think that's you again, right?
It is, Madam Chair, I appreciate it. As we have been in the habit for the past few years around this time frame, we wanted to bring for your consideration just an update on the public university finances in the state. We collect a lot of information from them, and we typically look at it two different ways. One via their general fund, which is kind of what we're presenting today, and then a second framework is through a larger analysis of their total funding, including their foundation assets, and we put that into a conditions analysis, financial conditions analysis report, which will be published in February. So we're working on that, but wanted to share some information about where they ended their last fiscal year, so fiscal year 2022, and give you a preview of what fiscal year 2023, their current fiscal year, where they may end up with that. Of course, a big part of that is enrollment, and so you heard Amy Cox and her team at the last month's commission meeting talk a little bit about fall term FTE enrollment, which has dropped 4.7% in the last 5 years, and only 2 of the 7 universities have seen enrollment growth in that time frame. And so that's important because enrollment is a proxy for understanding their financial condition. As their enrollment goes, so does their financial situation go as well. And so fiscal year 2022 is an interesting year because we saw for most of the institutions that they generated an operating surplus across all 7. They generated an operating surplus of $37.3 million, which means they collected $37 million more than they spent. They collected about $1.8 billion in total general fund revenue and spent just over $1.76 billion in expenses. 65% of all their revenue was related to tuition and fees. 26% of their revenue was from state appropriations, including debt service, and 9% was other revenue, including indirect cost recovery. 80%, a full 80%, 80 cents out of every dollar they spend is for salaries, wages, and related benefits. 19%, or about $330 million, was on supplies and services, and about 1% on other expenses. Their fund balance collectively across all 7 institutions, their fund balance grew 11%. It now tops $400 million, which is about 2.7 months worth of expenses. We typically recommend that they have anywhere from 2.5 months to 3 to 4 months. That's based on their board policy. Each board typically will establish its own policy. As we look forward to 2023, so we're about roughly halfway through the current fiscal year, and we asked them after fall enrollments were known to project the remainder of the fiscal year. For this fiscal year, 2023, we expect total revenues to grow 5.3%. However, expenses are projected to grow 7.5%. So the difference between that roughly 2% difference between the two is going to lead to a structural deficit or a net loss for most of them. Many of them, however, are structuring their budgets to accommodate that. So some of them will address that deficit either through budget adjustments, whether it be on the expense side or on the revenue side, or they're going to use some of their fund balances to address that structural gap. We are projecting by the end of the fiscal year that there will be an ending fund balance in the neighborhood of $404 million for all 7 of them, which will be 2.6 months of operating expenses. So even though there's a structural gap between revenues and expenses, we don't think it'll detrimentally impact their general fund balance in a significant way, but that remains to be seen over time. And so more information is included in your docket item with much more specificity in the appendix on the results of fiscal year 2022. And I will pause there for questions.
Yes,
Commissioner
Madam,
Devlin?
thank you, Madam Chair. If I can just go back to this. I did have a question about a couple of the universities. I'm a little bit concerned about PSU continuing to decline in enrollment, but not as concerned as I am about two of the regionals, because PSU has substantial reserves, and also there are other factors there that might be. There's a long history with some of our regionals having issues with solvency, and two institutions here, I mean, Southern Oregon has lost approximately 1/5 of its students. The only positive here is that they appear to have levelized. But then Western Oregon, which has lost about 30% of its students, has not levelized. It continues to decline in enrollment in the last 2 years. While it's good to look at the overall amount in reserves, these are individual institutions, and one of these is down to 0.9 months of operating revenue. Is there going to be, do you foresee that there's going to be a discussion in the next year about these institutions in terms of another discussion about their significant issues with staying solvent? And particularly these two institutions, Western Oregon and Southern Oregon?
I think the short answer is yes, but let me offer a little more specificity around that, Commissioner Devlin, because we've been, as staff, in touch with all 7 of the universities and are acutely interested in the underlying mechanics and the details, and we ask lots of questions. I give a lot of credit to the leadership of the institutions and their boards for engaging in very thorough, very strategic, and very tough conversations. Southern Oregon University, in particular, has endeavored to collaborate with all of its institutional stakeholders on a process which will lead to changes that they think they need to make to their campus around how they operate. So Dr. Bailey and his team, I think, have really done a great job and will continue to do so looking forward, better managing the operations of the institution. They were a few years ago in a set of circumstances in which they had to make tough decisions, and they find themselves, to your point, because of enrollment challenges in the same set of circumstances. And so, but I believe in their ability to have those conversations with institutional stakeholders and to make those tough decisions. Western is similarly situated. They have a new president who we've been talking to, and I give their vice president for finance, Dr. Perriman, a lot of credit for her and her team's efforts to really think and strategize around what the future could look like for their organization. Eastern Oregon University similarly has seen some enrollment challenges in the last 3 to 5 years. They've made a lot of progress in restructuring and trying to address the cost pressures that they face. One of the challenges that we think all 7 of the universities will face going forward is enrollment, because demographics suggest in this state that the glory days of yore, where you could just enroll 2 to 3% more students every year, and that would generate additional tuition revenue that would allow you to relieve some of the cost pressure. Those days are in the rearview mirror. And so, as was pointed out in the higher education landscape study that NCHAMS conducted, I forget the exact quote, but they basically said the universities are in a bit of a pickle because of the enrollment challenges going forward. So the the institutions are going to have to own that and have to decide for themselves through their boards what that means for them. I give PSU a lot of credit as well. Just recently, they published a report recently, I think it was last year in 2021, but they published a very detailed and robust report of their thinking about how they could reposition themselves going forward. And so I know that work continues on their campus as well.
Thank you.
Jim, I don't doubt at all everything you say about the hard work and the difficult questions they're facing on their campuses and the seriousness with which they're approaching that. I guess I just feel like, especially as Commissioner Devlin said, with Southern and Eastern, but also with some of the others, that we've seen this, and it's now at the point of cascading a little bit. And yes, we've had the pandemic, and yes, we're facing the demographic changes in that age group, which will probably accelerate or could potentially accelerate the decline. I guess I just don't want to be in a position as a committee and as a commission of just reacting to that after the fact. So if you could perhaps, and other staff and the presidents, but talk about how to best present to us within the first half of 2023, a detailed look at enrollment and the declines and our expectations for the next several years. And I'm purposely not dictating sort of the approach to that, but somehow I think we have to get at that beyond the how much is in reserves, because it is potentially an existential threat to them. And we know how important these regional universities are. And again, our responsibility to help make sure we are all asking the same questions and questions that help determine that path. So maybe one meeting in the first half of the year that's really devoted to enrollment and enrollment problems and how we're going to get ahead of it. And Commissioner Adams, I did not mean to butt in front of you, please.
Oh, no worries, Chair. Jim, I looked at the summary of the financial position and I could not distinguish whether the year-over-year comparisons are impacted by COVID-related infusions of cash, and whether the delta between the year after those infusions stop and a year or two before, whether it will be more dramatic than we think as a result of changes in funding coming from the federal government. Do you have a sense of that?
I do, and I appreciate the question. I was just looking at federal spending, and so the institutions in Oregon, and this includes all public and private, to be fair, more than 60 plus, but all of our higher education institutions in this state received $781.6 million in higher education emergency relief funding from the federal government. And as of the end of September, they have spent 94% of that money, so $737.6 million. And so a good amount of that was spent in fiscal year 2021, but strategically, many of the institutions and a good number of our public universities reserved some of that for fiscal year 2022, especially so that they could spread out the student portion of that, because if you recall, that federal funding most of it was split half and half, institutional funding and student-based funding. They were obligated under the rules to direct half of that funding directly to students so that the students could use that to pay for the related costs of attending university. So a fair chunk of that was used in fiscal year 2022. How much exactly, I'd have to look up. But I think it's safe to say It was some, but not very much. And I think it is also safe to conclude, though, that in fiscal year 2022, we do think that the good results, the operating surplus that we saw was largely related to that. And that's why fiscal year 2023 is important, because that money goes away. It was one-time money, it goes away. Most of it's been spent, so they won't have that. At the same time, their expenses continue to grow. So they're going to be challenged as fiscal year 2023 is almost, we're pivoting away from and out of the pandemic and away from having those significant federal resources to serve as kind of a cushion, a buffer.
Okay, Jim, so I see this effect in lots of different places, and we're coming out of the pandemic into an inflationary environment that's stressful. I mentioned this at the last meeting. I see a problem here. And the problem seems like it will be bigger than the numbers indicate. So I don't know how you can get us ready, Jim, but I feel like this conversation may be coming as we leave the pandemic stimulus and we head out into an inflationary environment for all of the university expenses, that we'll have to, have some pretty serious talk here. And we may be walking right into this conversation about allocating funding for community colleges at a time when they're coming to religion on these issues. And so I just want to get us ready for, I guess my statement to the commission is I'm seeing this in a lot of places. And we should get ready for real serious conversation about increasing cost and decreasing revenues and what we will do about it.
Thank you, Commissioner Adams. Commissioner Simon, I'm going to go. Commissioner Devlin, is it on this point?
Yes, it is.
Okay, I'll go to you, and then I have a comment, and then I'm going to come to you, Commissioner Simon. Go ahead.
I would just like to add that I would want you to look also at what the impact has been of the significantly declining portion of the need that's met by state general funds, not the broad universities general funds, but state general funds. Even before what looks like a significant real dilemma here, particularly given the most recent comments, for some of the regionals, just a change of a few hundred students would put them in a position of having a loss. And I don't think that would be the case if we were back anywhere close to even 35 or 40% being funded by the state. And I think you mentioned your new calculation was something like 26. And I don't think we're doing anything in this coming biennium or expecting anything in this coming biennium that will reverse that significantly. And I think the less the state takes responsibility for some of these needs and the burden is put on students and parents, the more volatile the solvency of these regional institutions is going to become.
And I would add as a footnote to both what Commissioner Adams said and especially what Commissioner Devlin just said, when you look, because of the declining enrollment and enrollment problems, when you look at the percentage of on each regional, the percentage that is taken by retirement and health insurance only, those two items now represent 25% at Eastern and at Southern, compared to of their total revenue from all sources. And so to the extent that burden falls to students or parents, it's sort of a question of what's the state responsibility, and that's a big percentage difference. The rest of if you add those two items for the rest of the universities, it's right around 20%. So you have 5 percentage points difference there with the ones who can least afford it. And of course, the more students they lose, the bigger percentage that percent is going to rise. But just looking at healthcare and retirement, and when I realized the amount of their resources taken by those two categories, it is pretty alarming. Thank you. And thank you for your patience, Commissioner Simnett. I did not mean to postpone your comments this long.
Oh, no worries. And in fact, I was just going to mention what has since been mentioned since I raised my hand. Is I had questions about state general fund support, and thinking that this is an assumption that is. I know that has dramatically decreased, and if we're planning of that to stay the same or continue to decrease, then that does indeed seem like a very dramatic problem that we're going to be faced with. And I'm just curious about whether there is a potential of increasing state general fund support, or if it's just a foregone, like that's never going to happen and we just have to move work in a new environment.
Jim or anyone have any wisdom along those lines? Notice the deafening silence on that question.
I was hoping that I mean, I suppose the question is somewhat rhetorical, but I was secretly hoping that there is an answer to that.
Okay, I'll share just a little bit of perspective, which may be helpful. None of us can forecast with any accuracy what the outcome of the legislature's decisions in 2023 will be with respect to state investment in higher education, right? There's a lot. I think there's a big range of possible outcomes, and we hope for and will advocate for the best possible outcomes there. I will say what has been slightly predictive in the past, or somewhat predictive, and I think that Commissioner Devlin had to leave, but if he's still on, he would be really the best to share this, is the broader state fiscal picture, right? So every biennium, the state budget staff sort of evaluate or project state revenues and state expenses. And in some years or some biennia, the projected state revenues, they're projected to outpace state expenses, right? Which then gives, I think, reason for optimism that certain categories of state spending, such as in education, can be increased, right? In other years, projected state revenues are less than projected state expenses, which gives rise to a lot of fear that everything or things will be cut. The current projections, at least as they are described to us by the state's chief financial officer, suggest we should have, again, very big picture, very general, we should have very modest expectations for this upcoming legislative session. That the likelihood of a mild recession in the coming biennium will put a damper on revenue growth, and that a lot of recent and increased state spending, some of which has a continued kind of service level cost associated with it, will swallow up any remaining or most of the remaining revenue growth. And so they're just, as you look broadly at the state budget, there just does not appear to be, we're unlikely to be in the position of having a lot of capacity for new spending, which will make it difficult to address this higher education, this public university problem of the proportion of costs that are borne by the state versus students. I think we should turn to Commissioner Devlin now, because this was his world for the better part of a couple of decades.
Madam Chair.
Yes, please go ahead.
Well, the state economist just rendered his report recently, the December forecast, which actually comes in November, which is actually forecasting a mild recession in the next biennium, which actually mild means a decline in revenue in the next session. And I think, given the commitments that were made by the legislature in the last session, particularly in the area of human services and healthcare, it's going to be very difficult to balance those budgets because the costs are going to increase really substantially. I mean, I've looked at the agency request budgets for both for DHS and for OHA, and they're incredible in terms of what they're requesting. I don't know what world they're in. They're not in this world, but even if you start to look more closely at what their underlying costs will be reflected in their ability to perform the same services in the coming fiscal year, those costs would be very significant. And it's going to be very difficult to balance this budget. I think too many times people make commitments without looking at the long-term impact of those commitments, or make commitments on the basis of short-term gains and long-term liabilities without looking at what the costs are going to be in the future. So I think the legislatures and the governor-elect are going to have a very difficult time balancing this budget in the next biennium. But I do think they need to pay attention to education and the needs in education. Higher education is always talked about very positively, whether it's community colleges or 4 institutions. But unfortunately, sometimes it ends up being pretty close to the bottom of priorities when dollars are actually being allocated. And I think you're getting up to a point now where it's getting very critical that the state needs to do something to better support its higher education institutions, both community colleges and 4-year institutions, particularly if they want to have any type of a reasonably good economic future in this state.
Thank you, Commissioner Devlin, for your expertise, even though it is not always cheering. It is always helpful. Commissioner Hayman, did you have a final comment or question on this subject, and then we'll move on?
Thanks, Chair Rowe. I really appreciate that. And this is hopefully a quick follow-up on Commissioner Devlin's comment. I just think the hope is in a longer vision, and I would encourage. I do personally. I go back to the main recommendation that came out of the NCHEM's landscape report, which is that we need to work together to develop a long-term vision for the state, economic vision for the state, in which education is the principal driver, so that people can see the longer-term investment. Because if all we see is short-term, higher education is discretionary. A whole lot of other things in the state budget are not. And I would just, so it's got to. We have to. Again, I just think that we have to change the conversation about the critical place that higher education plays in the economic future of this state. And I think I think that's the only way we're going to get the kind of long-term investment that we really need in higher education. So that's me.
It's the right point to make. That's what we have to keep thinking and keep saying, and just making sure that we are pushing that message forward. Okay, thank you for that good discussion. I appreciate it very much. Okay, Jim Pinker, you are on capital, right? Is that our next step? Capital principles. And if you can, Jim, I apologize. We're already running a little bit late, and I really need to wrap us up about 5 minutes of 3, no later than. So if you can get us through this in the next 15 minutes, that would be very helpful.
I'd be happy to, absolutely.
Or less.
Yeah, so this docket item is really a response to, I think, some questions at the November or even October F&A meeting. Really a timeline structure in that it explains the past 5, 6, 7 years in how we've approached capital, really for the universities, but also community colleges. One of the big responsibilities and functions that the HECC is tasked with is to, determine the strategic investments in the states, community colleges, public universities, and student access programs. And so how do we go about doing that work? And what principles do we use to inform the rubrics that we use to score the projects? We, as a matter of practice, accept a bunch of submitted projects. We allow the universities and the community colleges to submit projects, and then we make no effort or attempt to cull that list. Rather, we make a great effort to prioritize those projects. So to enable the conversation amongst the legislative members to focus on, if you have a level of resources based on funding availability, where should you draw the line? Because all the projects are usually worthy. And so this docket item makes an attempt and does nothing more than try to just lay out what those principles are. I will point out though on page 3, this is kind of a new component, something we've been working on recently, especially for the universities. When a project is brought forth for an emergency board request, what are the guiding questions that we may ask to better inform whether or not you as commissioners should forward that request to the e-board for consideration? So in page 2, you can see that we've laid out a framework, some guiding questions that are more qualitative. They're not very quantitative. So this is a little more art than perhaps science would mandate. But this is our attempt to lay out what we would look at as a HECC staff in considering those projects. We have previously in the past established precedent that really there should be no requests outside of the ARB process, but if an emergency should occur, how would we know if it was a true emergency, and what would that look like, and what questions would we ask? So that conversation is laid out at the top of page 3 for your consideration, and the appendix includes both the public university capital rubric and the community college capital rubric. Both are 100 points. And so you can see those referenced for your consideration. We've spent recently more time on the public university rubric because in 2019, we conducted a strategic capital development plan that informed some changes that were made to the rubric. We think the rubric is a better product because of that work that was done now 3 years ago. But nonetheless, the rubrics are included in the appendix, and I won't bore you with all the details. Over time, in the future, you'll hear more about some of these. But I think, Madam Chair, I can leave it at that and pause for questions and comments.
Questions? This was a detailed and good summary, Jim, in the materials. Are there questions about it? Does everyone understand it? Okay. Well, thank you. Anything else for the good of the order? Then we are adjourned. Thank you all very much for this rich discussion. I'll give a summary of it before the whole commission tomorrow, and please jump in if I leave out any important questions or comments that you made. Appreciate it. Have a good evening and see you tomorrow. In person, I hope.